Welcome to the Doomscroll News Report here on Radio Taiwan International, where I, Hannah Belinsky, and my co-host,
Amanda Stevens,
cover some of the biggest international news stories dominating our news feeds from the last week. I'm Hannah, and this week we're tackling how the cuts to the United States Agency for Global Media stand to impact the state of journalism now and in the near future.
And so before we get started, a quick little introduction to what we want this show to be. Of course, you know Hannah and I as writers and program producers here at Radio Taiwan International, but we wanted to kind of branch out and do something else because Hannah and I were discussing in the office about how we just can't seem to stop doom scrolling these days. You know, when you're on your phone and you just keep scrolling up and up and up and seeing more and more bad news, and instead of just reading about it and feeling bad, we decided it would be good for us to have a talk show where we bring some of the biggest news stories that we've encountered on our news feed in the last week and try to put some context to it and discuss it here together. And maybe you can also find some release in our discussions and some context to help put those into a larger conversation about what's going on in the world. A funny thing to say because we're starting with something that's not very recent but is very relevant to us. Hannah.
Given our line of work, it seems appropriate to kick things off with a pulse check on the state of a global media that seems to be growing increasingly frail following U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order gutting the USAGM on March 14th. Just a few days after the order, large-scale layoffs began at Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, and other independent media outlets funded by the USAGM. Beware, beware, the Ides of March indeed.
Yeah, the news story isn't, it's not as new as some of the other stories that we'll be studying, but something that we wanted to start with is because the effects of it are still very much being felt out, I think, as we're going along. And also, as to people who work in radio, it's eminently appropriate for us. I also, when I was reading about this, didn't quite realize the reach that these organizations had, specifically looking at Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe. Because if you listen to us, thank you so much. We need all our radio listeners out there.
Please.
But if you're a podcast listener out there, you probably don't understand the reach that they had, assuming that you are like me. I didn't realize how far spread they were.
And they started a really long time ago. They're decades old.
Yeah.
Reporting,
You go first. That's okay.
I was going to say, reporting for NPR, David Folkenflik described how Voice of America's journalists went to work on March 15th only to find that they had been locked out. More than 1,000 people employed at VOA and the Office for Cuba Broadcasting were basically shown the door. The USAGM also severed all contracts for its international broadcasters like Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and the Middle East broadcasting networks. And like I was saying, a lot of these networks have been operating for 70 to 80 years, and they reached hundreds of millions of readers and listeners throughout more than 100 countries in 63 languages in total. Crucially, they delivered news coverage to places where free press is threatened or non-existent, and they served as a model of the kind of independent journalism that I personally think is what makes America so great. I'm kind of a free speech absolutist in that way.
Well, I mean, I think to the full disclosure point, we are both Americans, but that is something that specifically we're taught very early. I also think, though, it's something that we don't necessarily have an appreciation for until you're somewhere or until you're next to somewhere, perhaps, where that's not necessarily a given right. Because in another article that we were reading about this, they were describing who some of the listeners that these, Radio Free Asia and Radio Liberty reached and where they got to. So one of the great things about these radio stations is you can just send out radio waves. People can pick them up wherever you go. It's not like I don't have internet access. I can't listen to Spotify, right? You can pick up radio waves once they're sent out. So it has
truly
the ability,
free.
Yeah, it has the ability to reach people in remote places or places where there are very strict media, what's that word? Censorship and crackdowns. And that was part of the purpose of it. It was made in World War II to try to reach these occupied places where, and to make a model of what a free speech environment might look like.
And feel like, crucially.
Yeah.
It's
and to their credit, they did a lot of, at the time that it was first published, a lot of their reporting was they had good news stories for, at that time during World War II, I assume it was the Allied forces, but they also did publish setbacks and problems that they had because the idea of it was to model a free speech environment, which includes criticism and critique. And that is also like, a necessary part as to people now working in the media.
Right.
That's a necessary part, right? That's how we learn and grow, and that's how we find out problems that need to be solved.
Yeah, we kind of take for granted we come to work and we don't really have to worry about getting grabbed and thrown in jail just for something we have written, you know?
Yeah. And to that point, even today, like the places that Radio Free Asia reaches out to, for example, just to use that one since we're very close to it, Radio Free Asia is responsible for a lot of the reporting that we know about the Uyghur situation in China.
Yep.
And in the CNN article, we also read an article in CNN by Brian Stelter, who mentioned that, like, not that long ago, like within the last 10 years, a North Korean fisherman was executed because he was listening to Radio Free Asia. I think it was Radio Free Asia, but one of these funded organizations that is now being cut, because to him it's free media. It's not state-controlled media. And he's not the only person who was trying to listen to it to get uncontrolled media, right? That also happens they were describing it happening in Russia and the Kremlin. And the reporters for these organizations, there are still reporters who work for them after they got cut who are in jail.
Yeah.
And now they're in jail, and their organization, which would normally be fighting to get them out, doesn't have any funding to follow up on them.
It's kind of terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah.
The article, I thought this was interesting, what Brian Stelter
CNN article.
wrote. Yes, the CNN article. Something about the USAGM, it extends kind of beyond media directly. It also bankrolled the Open Technology Fund. I didn't know this. This fund fights online censorship and promotes an open internet. It counters repression, surveillance by authoritarian regimes. The fund supported the development of Signal, the encrypted messaging app that's been like a hot news topic more recently for other reasons. I don't know how much you know about Signal, but I first heard about it during the George Floyd protests against police brutality back in 2020. And the app basically allows for secure and private communications. So it's especially useful among protesters and activists who are trying to organize rallies and other demonstrations. And to me, this makes the cuts to USAGM feel especially ominous. A free press is very much linked to the ability to freely communicate in general and to assemble with other like-minded people to express support or dissent.
It's true. It also speaks to a little bit of hypocrisy behind this decision, right? Which is something that I wanted to highlight when I think we missed a little bit of background information because we were both just discussing this right before we...
Too eager.
Yeah, we were discussing this right before we started recording, but the USGAM stands for the United States, what is it?
Agency for Global Media. Oh, wait.
Agency for Global Media. And the USGAM, the United States Agency for Global Media, does not own any of these radio stations, but it does fully fund them. So the radio stations that are funded by USGAM include Voice of America, include Radio Free Asia, include Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. And all of these, and those have also kind of like spiraled out. There's another media organization that I'm forgetting the name of. There's one in Cuba as well.
Right.
So they are across many different languages. And again, so it is crucial that they are not necessarily owned by the government, but they are funded by it. Something else that I think is important, like background information, is that this is a form of like soft diplomacy.
Oh, yeah, soft power.
Yeah, soft power, soft diplomacy, modeling against, in this specific case, authoritarian regimes.
Usually I'm not like pro make everybody America. I don't believe in that. I don't think we should be those imperialist guys. But I do think like the American model of journalism, of a free press, that is something to aspire to.
Well, and so now that we have that background information, this is something that I think I found very interesting because Voice of America has been criticized. Now, most of its heavy critics are from authoritarian regimes. So,
go figure.
Yeah, can you believe it? So, from China, from Russia, from Viktor Orban, and of course Iran, right? Yes. And now, in these places where journalists have been, and at least 2 or 3 of those journalists are currently imprisoned.
Yep.
In somewhere in Russia and in China as well.
Yep.
But in these places, Voice of America has been criticized as being too American or trying to Americanize everybody there and spreading American propaganda. In the United States, one justification for cutting it was because Elon Musk, the person who funds Doge, not funds, he doesn't fund Doge, sorry, take that back. The person who runs Doge, who is recommending all of these cuts, wanted it to be cut because he said it was anti-American propaganda.
He's South African,
I know.
What does he know? He knows he doesn't know anything
but
about
it's
this.
just like this clear kind of like conflict of interests. And it is interesting to point out, these people who are least happy about these free press, these modeled free press environments are authoritarians who the current administration in the United States seems to be very interested in fostering a relationship with.
Yep.
I can't say to like what degree, but I think we can say there have been like noticeable names missing from like the recent tariffs,
Just
where
weird
Russia was
stuff.
gone.
Yeah.
In this case, defunding these free press organizations that are operating most heavily criticized in authoritarian areas, and also criticizing it for not being American enough. I don't know.
I find it a little bit funny that Slovenia didn't get hit with any reciprocal tariffs. There's Melania's influence for you.
There you go.
We'll be right back after a little bit of break. So you mentioned earlier how America's, I don't want to say enemies, but, ideological rivals were basically happy about this move. And so before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about how Chinese state media is basically cheering on Trump's decision.
It's not just our words.
Yes. Kate
Statements.
Lamb, she was reporting for The Guardian. She described Chinese media's reaction to the Trump administration's decision to gut USAGM as gleeful, literally, with the Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece Global Times saying Voice of America only ever had a bad track record when it came to reporting on China. Radio Free Asia's president, Bei Fong, said closing down RFA effectively allows the CCP to dominate the narrative unchecked in the information space. So you just know they're doing a little bit of a jig.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's exactly it, right? Is like, of course, that's the... Well, we don't necessarily appreciate. I feel like I'm getting a soapbox here for like pro radio, but kind of like when you have access, like many of us, I hope many listeners out there can appreciate, like when you have access to internet, when you have access to TV, when you have access to be able to search out different points of view. Obviously, we all have different points of view we default to, we prefer, but most of the time, you're not forced to only listen to one of them. Right. And the thing is, like, these people who live in these countries are not stupid. Obviously, like they know that, like, I'm getting state media.
Yeah.
Right. That's something that I think we need to be very clear about. Right. And then there are always going to be people there who want to know, like, is that true? Right.
Totally. Yeah.
Even within, like, I think we can see this within the United States. I've had friends who have asked me before about, like, living outside of the United States. Like, how is something internally being covered by external media, right? Like you always have that curiosity. But now with these players gone, with Radio Free Asia gone, that's the one I think closest to us here in Asia.
I agree.
Right? There is no free extra voice out there.
Yes.
And that's not to say that it was never like free of danger as represented by like the tragic case in North Korea. But like there was no, you didn't have to pay to
it was an option.
Listen to it. You didn't have to like use the internet. You just needed a radio, right? So it definitely is just kind of a loss of another viewpoint.
Totally, yes. And what I find funny is when you compare Beijing's language to this press release from the USAGM website, starting with this very charming, blatantly editorialized headline, USAGM Senior Advisor Kari Lake cancels obscenely expensive 15-year lease that burdened the taxpayers and enforces Trump's executive order to drastically downsize agency. Geez, not only does it serve to show just how ideologically captured the USAGM is now, but don't you think if communist regimes are denigrating a democratic government agency using just about the same language you use, that you maybe have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way?
You think. I mean, you'd hope, right? But I mean, like, I guess let's get into like the current state of these two things. That was something I looked up right before I came
state.
here. No. Well, it is interesting because I did want to follow up. Now, a lot of these, again, for you listening out there, like a lot of these news sources Like we said, this isn't the most top of mind. This isn't the most recent story we've covered. These come from mid to early March.
Right.
So I checked in before we recorded this, like what is the current state of. The easiest one for me to get a hold of was Voice of America, because I think that's the one kind of at the heart of these things.
Yes.
So after the funding was cut, so the two things that happened at Voice of America that are very important are all of the employees, literally everybody there, 1,300 people, were put on indefinite leave, where they are still receiving payment, but not allowed to do their jobs. Which to me, two questions. I'm not really sure how that cuts funds.
Yeah.
What
about cutting waste?
That might have been changed. That was per the original recording.
Right.
Not a lot of follow up on where that is. However, like 1 week or during that week that it was shut down, all of like the website completely stopped being updated. You can still go to the Voice of America website. All of the news stories you'll see there are from early March.
It's very eerie.
It is. It's kind of like going into somebody's house when they're on vacation.
Nobody's there.
Nobody's there. And they are still putting out programming, but the only programming you will see from Voice of America at this point in time, is pre-scheduled programming and music shows. So essentially things that don't require reporters or reporting, right? Maybe something you can outsource to a freelancer. And that's still where it is, because there is still litigation concerning whether or not these things are even legal in the United States.
Aren't they trying to sue? I'm pretty sure they're organizing some kind of lawsuit.
Kari Lake, in theory, if we were to get into the minutia of it, Kari Lake has questionable legality to do this, meaning it may not be legal for her, even though she's the Voice of America, to just shut down the whole thing and remove all the funding, because the funding is allotted by Congress. And in the United States, usually what that means is that Congress itself has to decide not to fund these things anymore. You're not just allowed to, one person who works for one of these organizations is not allowed to overrule the 100 people who work for Congress.
And historically, USAGM has always gotten bipartisan support, across the aisle. Everybody could kind of agree.
Yes, and that is a thing. Like it does have bipartisan support because this is a noble mission that I think gets to something that's at the heart of what many, I'm even going to go farther and say many North Americans really value outside of just the United States, right? That's kind of a shared value I think a lot of people in that diaspora have.
I agree.
So, and I mean, we're overseas. We work at news media. I think we have that same kind of thing.
Of course we care,
Right. But so that's kind of where it is sitting right now. As for these other programs, people haven't been paid for a month. So going into Radio Free Asia, the money that is, they're funded, not owned, right? But then they haven't been receiving any money. And so people haven't been paid. People didn't even get paid in March. If the paychecks were supposed to go out later, they didn't receive funding, so they couldn't do payroll. So people have, at the time that was written, they were considering furloughs. Those have likely gone through. That also kind of carries out to Radio Free Europe and to all these other stations. It's kind of, and until the problem of funding can be solved, it's kind of like a slow death, which might be what they're hoping for, is perhaps an atrophy of these services, so that even if the funding does get back up, there's no one to give it to.
Yeah, I think that gives them more plausible deniability. It's just you kind of kneecap the organization and then go busy yourself doing other things. And then by the time people get around to trying to fix it, it's kind of maybe a little bit irreparable, at least in parts.
Right. And I mean, there has been some kind of controversy between these two things, but I think a bigger part of it is this growing conservative movement to have more influence over, in the United States specifically. I can't speak too much to outside of that, but I know the growing effort to control more of that free speech media is cited in a lot of these articles. Something I found really telling was the first article we read by NPR. They had over 20 people who they discussed who worked for the organization. None of them wanted to offer their names because they were afraid of retributive action. Yeah. Which is a thing that is really happening. People were too afraid to put their name to something, except for the chief officer. He's the manager.
It's pretty harrowing. It doesn't feel like America anymore when people are like, can I remain anonymous?
When so many people are afraid, right? And that's always part of this kind of uncovering journalism, I think, around the world. But when you have over 16 people, none of them wanted to speak up or offer their name because they were afraid of being punished. And to validate their fear, there were Doge people who were literally camped out in their office. Yeah. Making sure that nobody is doing their job, surveilling them, watching them do that.
Big Brother is watching. They're in the panopticon. I just want to, before we wrap up for the day, I just want to add, I hate how everything sounds like Trump-ese now. Like, there in that headline, you see obscene. And as you read through that press release, you see eye-popping, giant rot. Trump's tendency to repeat words and his, I want to say, inability to say anything that's actually meaningful has really kind of degraded the entire journalistic profession. He makes us all sound stupider and harder to take seriously just for having to quote him when we write the news. It would be funny if it weren't so sad.
There have definitely been a couple of headlines where it could be funny, but definitely I think it adds to like a shortening attention span, a shortening vocabulary for what we have in the period of time that we have to present information is also like, I think, a part of that, right? This not enough attention to get to anything.
I remember reading somewhat recently, I can't remember the source, but the statistic stuck with me. It's something like 1 in 3 Americans are functionally as literate as like a grade schooler now.
That's a shame.
It didn't used to be like that.
No.
I can kind of understand people thinking journalists are too often these out-of-touch liberal elites. I do think some of them are, but there are also really hardcore reporters out there risking their freedom and even their lives to expose the truth. And I think we really owe it to those people to fight propaganda and to enable truly free exchange of information.
And to, reward that, even if it's not something that you yourself use. We don't make every service for ourselves.
That's
Sometimes
right.
we make that to try and help other people out there who don't have access to anything else.
Exactly.
If you want to do something, write to somebody about this.
Well, that's it for today's news report. I'm Hannah Valinsky.
And I'm Amanda Stevens.
Thanks for joining us on Air Today. Tune in tomorrow for more programs by Radio Taiwan International. And in the meantime, remember to stop scrolling and touch grass. We'll see you next week.
Catch the latest RTI news, programs, previews, and more on our website, en.rti.org.tw.